In this tutorial, we're going to cover feral bear tanks. Let's begin by covering stats and reforging. As you can see from the stats equation, agility is the most important primary stat, followed by stamina. The two most important secondary stats are dodge and mastery. Let's move on to reforging. When reforging, you'll have two primary objectives. First, if you find that you're experiencing too many threat generation issues, consider increasing your expertise and hit rating. Next, focus on maximizing dodge and mastery. On any gear items that lack dodge, reforge your weakest stat into dodge. Now, on gear that has dodge but doesn't have mastery, reforge your weakest stat into mastery. Let's take a look at some useful gems that you can use to socket your gear as a feral bear tank. You can see various lists of gems on the screen right now. As a rule of thumb, gem your gear with pure agility gems, those are the delicate inferno rubies, unless the socket bonus is agility, in which case it would be worth matching the sockets. Let's move on to some useful glyphs that you can use as a feral bear tank, starting with the recommended prime glyphs. The big three prime glyphs that you want to go with as a bear tank are the glyph of Berserk, the glyph of Mangle, and the glyph of Lacerate. These are pretty much hands down the best to go with. Let's take a look at the preferential major glyphs. You can see a list of the recommended major glyphs right now. They include the glyph of Rebirth, the glyph of Feral Charge, the glyph of Frenzied Regeneration, the glyph of Maul, and the glyph of Fairy Fire. Again, all of these major glyphs are preferential, but I will comment on the major glyphs that I chose. The first one, which I consider to be the most important, is the glyph of Rebirth. The way that Rebirth normally works is it'll bring a party member back to life, but it won't bring them back to life with full health. With the glyph of Rebirth, it will. So this I've actually used several times to prevent wives. It's a very nice glyph to have. I strongly recommend it. Let's move on to the other major glyphs that I went with. This one is the glyph of Maul. This causes your Maul to hit an additional target, but it doesn't do quite as much damage. It's still, in my opinion, worth having, especially for AoE tanking. And let's move on to the third one. This is the glyph of Feral Charge. I have mentioned this before in other videos that I really like any talent, any mobility sort of talent like Charge, or in the case of Warriors, Heroic Leap, Intervene, Intercept, and so on, and that's why I went with this. I usually will keep Feral Charge on cooldown or close to it. Feral Swiftness is definitely essential for bear tanks because, as you can see from the tooltip, it does increase your dodge chance by 4% while you're in bear form. Furor is actually one of the least useful talents for a bear tank in my opinion. I went with it because this is sort of a cookie cutter talent build that I found online on a very excellent website. But what Furor does is it will help you manage your energy a little bit when you change form. The way that I play, I really don't change form a whole lot that would warrant spending 3 talent points here. All tanking classes have a special ability that will reduce the attack speed, and it's usually by 20%. For example, Warriors have Thunderclap, Death Knights have, I believe it's called Frost Fever, and in the case of Feral Bear Tanks, they have Infected Wounds. Whenever you use an attack ability, it'll place a debuff on the target that not only increases the attack speed by 20%, but also reduces the target's movement speed by 50%. Let's move on to Fury Swipes. The way it works is it will give your auto attacks a chance to trigger a Fury Swipe, which deals 310% weapon damage. Now this can be nice for generating additional threat. Primal Fury is a nice energy refunding talent. The way it works is anytime you crit, it'll refund you 5 rage. Thick Hide is essential for all bear tanks. It does a couple of things for you. One, it increases your armor, which therefore increases your damage mitigation. It also reduces your chance to be critically hit by melee attacks by 6%, so this essentially makes you uncrittable. Let's very briefly take a look at Feral Aggression. This is very nice because it alters your Fairy Fire such that whenever you cast Fairy Fire, it'll automatically apply all 3 stacks. This way you don't have to continue to spam Fairy Fire to get 3 stacks. King of the Jungle is a nice talent to have for bear tanking. The way it works is anytime you use Enrage while in bear form, it will also buff your damage by 15%. The more damage you do, the more threat you generate. Primal Madness extends from King of the Jungle. The way it works is it will automatically, in the case of one talent, it'll automatically generate 6 rage, and it will also increase your maximum energy by 10. Feral Charge is absolutely essential. This is the equivalent of a warrior's charge ability. Leader of the Pack is an essential raid buff talent. It will increase your raid or party's critical strike chance by 5%. It also has another interesting property of whenever you crit, it'll heal you for 4% of your total health, which is obviously a nice thing to have as a tank. Brutal Impact is a wonderful talent for a couple of reasons. One, it increases the duration of your bash stun by 1 second. So it goes from 4 seconds to 5, which can be very nice. It also reduces the cooldown on your Skull Bash ability by a whopping 50 seconds. If we take a look at my Skull Bash here on the action bar, it has a very reasonable 10-second cooldown. If you play like I do and you religiously interrupt, it can be very beneficial. Survival Instincts is another essential tanking talent. This is the equivalent of a warrior's shield wall. When you activate it, it reduces all damage taken by 50%. Endless Carnage is a worthwhile talent. The reason comes back to our Pulverize ability. If you apply 3 stacks of Lacerate on a target and then you pulverize it, you'll receive a Pulverize buff that lasts 18 seconds with Endless Carnage. Without Endless Carnage, the Pulverize buff would only last 10 seconds, and that's just way too short. Natural Reaction is a powerful tanking talent. It does a number of things for you. One, it reduces damage taken while in bear form by a very significant 18%. It also increases your dodge chance by 6%, and it will even refund 3 rage every time you dodge while in bear form. Rend and Tear is more beneficial for feral cats than it is for feral bears. The only real thing it does for you as a bear tank is it will increase the damage done by your maul on targets that already have a bleed effect on them. Pulverize is one of your main abilities you'll be using on single targets while tanking. The way it works is it will look at the target to see how many Lacerate bleed effects are on it. When you cast Pulverize, it will then give you a Pulverize buff that increases your critical strike chance by 3% for each of the Lacerate dots. So ideally your rotation will consist of spamming Lacerate till you have 3 Lacerate dots up and then use Pulverize, because you want to maintain that Pulverize buff as long as possible. Let's move on to the final talent in the Feral Combat tree. This is Berserk. Let's talk about how Berserk benefits you as a feral tank. When you activate Berserk, it changes your Mangle in a couple of ways. It makes your Mangle no longer cost rage, and also it no longer has a cooldown. So you can just continually spam Mangle over and over and over on a single target. The one situation where I find myself using Berserk is if I'm fighting usually a caster that is making it difficult for me to generate rage, or I find myself running out of rage. That's when I'll activate Berserk. And that wraps up our talent discussion. Let's move on to the Feral Bear Tank's single target and AoE strategies.